Welcome everyone. Myself Dr. Praveen Kumar Pathak with my colleague Manisha Sharma. Today we are going to discuss another important issue which is related with inequalities and sustainable development. Now inequalities have various dimensions, and in this lecture we are going to examine how different matrices of inequality over time and different parts of the world have evolved and how they play an important role in terms of influencing the prospect of achieving sustainable development in different parts of the world, and some of the possible ways that might be implemented in different countries according to their development status in order to reduce the burden of inequalities in the level of development. Now, today I am going to show you a very brief data where we are looking at one of the most prosperous country in the world for a long time, the United Kingdom. So if you look at this important data of GDP per capita in UK since 1300 onwards till most recent 2020, so for large time of the progress and prosperity of England, the per capita income for 70 to 80% of this time period was somewhere close to 3 to 4 thousand pounds per person in the United Kingdom. However, in the last, say for example, 100 or 120 years, there has been a phenomenal increase in the level of standard of living of people in the last 120 years. So if you look at the development process in the UK, it has been very dramatic in the last 120 years. On the other hand, if you look at for the most part of the data that we have for the last 700 to 800 years, the per capita income in the UK was largely stagnated. Now if you remember that this large part of history of economic growth and prosperity in the context of UK or for the world as a whole was largely determined by agriculture allied activities. It was only after the advent of the industrial revolution post 1600 that there was massive consumption and exploitation of natural resources, which over the period of time led to the increase in the standard of living through the per capita income that we have witnessed in the UK. And particularly after the Second World War, there has been most dramatic increase in the income status of people living in UK and Europe elsewhere. So if you compare this scenario with what we have witnessed in other part of the world, so if you look at this graph, for world as a whole, the per capita income, say for example last 300 to 400 years had increased very modestly from somewhere around $2,000 to today it stands about $10,000. This is for an average global citizen. But if you compare the differences in the standard of living of the citizens in different part of the world, we find huge differences. So for instance, an average American citizens today is having a per capita income of roughly about $50,000. And if you compare and contrast with people in South Asia, take for example India, Pakistan and elsewhere, the per capita income is barely about $5,000 to $6,000. So if we compare simple average statistics between these countries living in Europe or in America versus those who are living in the global south, there is a difference of more than 10 times between some part of these regions. And if you go to some of the Middle East country, the per capita income in UAE, Saudi Arabia and many such countries, the income status is even higher. So what we observe that the material advancement in the life of people in different part of the world has been very, very variant and different from each other, which presents various implications for investment into their education, healthcare, basic infrastructure and overall human capital formations. Now this is another important example where this data set from our world data shows on the x-axis you have the GDP per capita for various countries in the world. On the y-axis you have CO2 emissions per capita. So clearly you see that countries which are economically lagging behind, closer to 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 US dollars, their contribution to the CO2 emission is almost negligible. So on the other hand, if you look at countries on the other side on the x-axis where per capita income is above 20,000 US dollars, like China, or 50,000 US dollars per capita consumption like the United States, and many such countries from Europe and North America, you find that there is a huge burden in terms of climate effects due to massive exploitation of natural resources. So the point that I want to emphasize here is this: as the per capita income or the standard of living is rising in some of the selected countries in the world, that is also going to have a very detrimental impact on other regions of the world, because of we are already witnessing tremendous implication driven by global warming, as a result of which we are observing that the monsoon pattern, the flow of water, the floods, the drought, all these extreme weather phenomena and their frequency is rising. So on the one hand, we find that accumulation of wealth, accumulation of material well-being is rising in some section of society of the world, but for large section of the world population, they are living in life of huge deprivation, huge lack of basic minimum needs or necessity of life is not available to them. And therefore, even though there are differences in their material circumstances, but as far as their capacity to respond to the global climate change impacts is also not the same. So if you compare countries which are in the global south where per capita income is less, so they have relatively lower resources to not only take care of themselves, but whenever we have these natural calamities, disasters, etc. that happen, they do not have capacities to respond to these natural calamities. On the other hand, possibly countries which are contributing on an average relatively more to carbon dioxide emissions and CO2 and other gases which are responsible for climate change impacts, they have relatively better resources to have systems in place to negotiate, to adapt and to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So this is another example of the global inequalities which are very much intertwined in many ways. Going forward, this another important slide indicates that as the per capita income or the economic growth generally happens, the population growth tends to go down. So here also, if you can see on the x-axis, you have the per capita income of different countries plotted against the population growth rates, and we observe countries where per capita income is fairly less, their population growth rates are very high. Now why that is the case? So of course, if you have a low per capita income, basically refers to that they have weak industrial infrastructure rather than the economy is mostly traditional, rural, agrarian. They have very limited healthcare systems, and hence you have higher mortality levels. Largely people are afflicted with communicable diseases, infectious diseases, and therefore the life expectancy in several of these societies, particularly located in the global south, in Africa and several Asian countries, where the life expectancy even today is somewhere around 45 to 50 years in many of these African nations. So when the life expectancy of the risk of death is high, particularly in the young ages, so in order to compensate for this higher risk of death, we have relatively higher fertility levels, and thus we observe that the population growth is actually higher in some of these societies. I mean, particularly if you see post Second World War, with improvement in global public health and medicine and medical technologies, we have been able to control to some extent the burden and the risk of death. But even then, on an average, if you look at IMR in these nations, if you look at maternal mortality in some of these nations, is disproportionately high, unfortunately, and therefore we observe that fertility levels are quite high. So therefore these are nations, they are nations where income level is less, resource availability is less, and the population age structure is very young. So you have a lot of children, youth population in this part of the world. And these are also countries wherein we have limited resources to properly feed people 3 times a day. We don't have enough resources to invest in quality education and healthcare services. And also there are immense challenges which are related with livelihood and job opportunities. So the net effect is that this vicious circle of deprivation and disease and lack of opportunities, which means that you have a situation of insecurities. And whenever these insecurities are higher, people people tend to have more children, so that out of maybe some children, some of them would survive and some of them would not survive. On the other hand, if you compare to countries where per capita income is above 40 to 50,000 US dollar per month, so there the issue is about quality of children rather than the quantity of children. And so therefore, because the opportunity cost in several of these countries are super high, so they would rather prefer to have either one kid or maximum two kids rather than having more number of children. Why? Because they have been able to establish institutions which actually provide certainty in life to a large extent. So there is a higher life expectancy, which means that people on an average have a higher life chances at the aggregate level. So most of these countries have a life expectancy at birth above 80 years, so which means that people are surviving longer life. So when you have longer life tendency, you plan for longer future. And because the opportunity costs are so high, so people choose to invest more into their careers, education, skill building, and they compare and contrast between quantity and quality of children. So this is how another example that how the economic and the resource status in a population is directly connected with population growth. So societies which are advanced in their economic status, they have been advanced because they have transitioned through demographic processes, and today they are at a state which is highly techno-friendly, highly advanced, where time in many ways is very costly, and therefore investing and bringing up a child require a lot of time for both husband and wife, and therefore couples needs to plan and decide their family size and composition. And accordingly, in many Western societies, we are actually now witnessing a scenario where people are even choosing not to have a baby at all. So these are different forms of living arrangement and family size preferences which we observe between advanced societies where economic status and development is relatively higher as compared to many of the developing society where people are still transitioning from agriculture to industries, manufacturing and service sector, which is a process and progress on it's a project on progress basically. Now this is another important statistics that I want to put before you if you contrast the life expectancy disparities at the global level. So in the pre-modern times, before agricultural revolution actually happened or around agricultural revolution, the life expectancy of human population among female was roughly about 20 years on an average, which meant that only, say for example, 63% of all the kids who were born were able to see their first birthday. And by the year of age of the 5, half of them would not survive. And only 30% would survive to see their 25th birthday. And only 8% would see their 65th birthday. So that was the kind of the risk of death which existed in the pre-modern times. So where you don't have much disparities and inequalities in historical time periods, primarily because the living conditions, the situation of subsistence was pretty much same in different part of the world. But as society progressed differently, as the technological development happened on different trajectories, what we have found in recent time is this, that in many sub-Saharan African countries today, the life expectancy barely is around 40 years on an average. If you look at the global scenario, it is roughly about 70 years at the time of birth. So on an average, we find that the difference between global life expectancy at birth and the people who are born in the sub-Saharan Africa is roughly about 25 to 30 years differences, which is an alarming difference if we are today talking about a world which is more secure, peaceful, prosperous, equal, prosperity of people and planet, intragenerational and intergenerational equality. So these are highly concerning figures. So these are like not very recent, maybe 2010 estimates, but if you go by this is very clear that there are various part of this world where life is still very uncertain, where life expectancy still is very low. So there is a huge scope for investment into their economic prosperity, into their public health institution, into their empowerment and capacity building. And if you compare this with countries, for example Japan, Canada, US, where life expectancy is beyond 85 years or 90 years on an average today. So an average Japanese citizen expect to live more than 85 years. They have a long period of time where they can plan and invest into their lives. So this is a world where if you are born today in Japan, you have a life expectancy at birth of roughly about 85 years. And if you are born in some of the countries from sub-Saharan Africa, today you have a life expectancy between 40 to 45 years. So net difference is about 40 years, just because you happen to be born in some part of the world which is economically, socially, culturally in some ways is lagging behind than other part of the world, maybe in the Far East Asia or Europe, or say for example in the US. So all these inequalities, if you want to unpack, it is important for us to understand that these different, whether it is economic inequalities, access to resources, or this translate into various other parts, investment in education, health, basic infrastructure. So all these are intertwined with each other, and so therefore there is a need to have a comprehensive agenda of action and global partnership, wherein the countries which are advanced in their technological know-how or resourcefulness must do a partnership with countries which are lagging behind, so that both can help each other to grow and contribute in this shared prosperity. And broadly, the agenda of sustainable development is this, helping everybody is a partner in the journey of sustainable progress. So countries which are advanced, they need to help and share knowledge and technology and resources, capacity building with countries which are lagging behind, because we all share this world of one family, one earth, and so therefore there is a human value system which is attached, and which actually mandates that we must, as a global citizen, help each other. There is a very important graph, also famously known as Preston Curve. So on the x-axis you have the per capita income in US dollars, on the y-axis you have the life expectancy at birth. So these are the countries which have been plotted at different decades. If you see, broadly the pattern is, as per capita income of country increases, if the per capita income of the country rises, you have a sharp increase in the life expectancy to begin with. But as the income level continues to increase, the curve becomes relatively plateau. So initially, as income in the country rises, for example, you have improvement in the life expectancy of people. What happens? You have a better access to food, you can afford better housing, you have better household environment, you have better access to healthcare services, education, etc. So that helps the country to improve the life expectancy to begin with for some period of time. But after achieving a certain level of the standard of living, improvement in the economic growth is probably not resulting into the same level of gains in the life expectancy as it was in the initial phases. So which tells you that after some point of time, the issues related with lifestyle choices that people makes carries a significant influence on the life expectancy of people, right? So that is what we observe in many of the societies even today. So this graph was given by Preston in 75, which is very much true to very much different studies from different part of the world still makes this finding very robust and true to their context, wherein initially, as economic growth happens in different societies and different countries, we observe that per capita income, the life expectancy improve to a certain extent. And beyond that, even if the per capita income increased to $1,000 or $10,000 or $50,000, that is not going to add to extended lifespan of human beings. Why? Because there is a process through which the human body deteriorates as people age. So after some time, even if you have how much dollars, that is immaterial. So the important thing in that case becomes the lifestyle that people actually practice, and the lifestyle begins from beginning of your lifespan, not at the once people become 60 or 75. So many times we see that if you compare the epidemiological transition, I will talk briefly about it in a few seconds, how does it unfold and how the pattern of diseases also varies from country to country, and how that is linked with the development process. This is another important interesting slide where we try to show the association between the Human Development Index on the x-axis and the total fertility levels on the y-axis. And if you compare, the blue color shows you the scenario in 1975 and the red color shows you the scenario most recent in 2005. And it shows that as the human development of different countries, so these are all the countries from the world for which we have this data for TFR and the Human Development Index. So as the HDI values score, the HDI score value varies from 0 to 1. So as country advances in their HDI scores, we observe that the fertility levels drastically comes down, which means that human development is linked with declining fertility levels, and they are very much interrelated. Why? Because we know that human development is a composite measure that try to understand association of income, education, and health gains on fertility levels. So as society does well on HDIs, the fertility level falls.